All right, so are you ready to unlock some serious language secrets?
Because today, we're diving headfirst into the heart of Czech.
Whether you're prepping for a trip to Prague or maybe trying to get a head start on some language homework.
Or even if you're just really curious about this awesome language, get ready because this deep dive is going to be good.
You know what's really wild about Czech is that it often gets labeled as this super complex language. But honestly, beneath all those consonants and grammar rules, there's this crazy vibrant language, a language totally shaped by history, by culture, even by technology.
Oh, absolutely.
Just waiting for someone to come and discover it.
And that's what we're here to do.
Exactly.
I mean, you didn't just bring one book about Czech. You didn't even bring two.
You brought a whole stack.
This is like a whole buffet of linguistics.
Yeah.
Everything from its Slavic roots to how it's used today, even in the digital age.
Exactly. And that's the thing. By piecing together all these different angles, the history, the linguistics, even a little bit of sociology, we can actually understand not just what makes Czech unique, but why it matters, especially to anyone listening who's trying to explore this language for the first time.
Okay, I love that. So for those of us who maybe need a little bit of a refresher on language family trees, where does Czech fit in with everything?
Okay, so Czech, it's part of what we call the West Slavic branch, and this is within the Indo-European family, which is a huge family of languages. And that means that Czech has some relatives you've probably already heard of, right? You've got Polish, you've got Slovak, and then some that maybe you haven't, like Kashubian, which is a really cool language spoken in some parts of Poland.
Kashubian, huh?
Yeah.
Gotta admit, that one definitely made me do a double take when I was looking through these materials earlier.
So it's Czech has its own little family reunion going on within the Slavic languages.
You could totally say that. And it's super important to keep that in mind because it explains why Czech and Slovak are so similar. They're basically siblings.
Which also kind of explains why I've always heard that they're mutually intelligible, right? You could probably have a pretty broken conversation with a Slovak speaker if you knew a bit of Czech.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Though, of course, like any siblings, they've got their differences, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Oh, yeah. I'm ready for some of those sibling rivalries.
But before we get there, the sources also mentioned this whole thing about standard Czech and then common Czech. What's the deal with that?
Is it having to dress up for a fancy dinner versus, just wearing your comfy clothes at home?
Okay, that is such a good analogy. Because, yeah, standard Czech is the polished, more formal version of the language. It's what you see in books, in newspapers, in official documents. It's what's taught in schools, and it's generally considered the, quote, correct way to speak and write. Now, common Czech, on the other hand, that's your comfy clothes version. It's the more relaxed, everyday language that people use in casual conversation.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Think of it as the Czech equivalent of, slang or all those regional dialects we were just talking about.
Gotcha. So if I was planning a trip to Prague, would I need to brush up on both, or would the standard version be enough to get by?
You'd definitely be able to communicate knowing standard Czech, for sure. But being able to recognize and even use some common Czech, it adds a whole different level to your experience. It's like being in on a secret.
Ooh, I like that.
And it shows locals that you're really making an effort to connect with their culture on a deeper level, which is always cool.
Okay, I do love the idea of unlocking those secret linguistic doors.
Now, I'm curious, how did these two different versions even come about?
Was there a big linguistic conference somewhere where they just decided, okay, we're splitting things up?
Not quite. Actually, this split, if you want to call it that, is a really common thing in linguistics. As languages evolve, they're used by different groups of people, different situations, and naturally they develop these variations. I mean, think about English. We've got formal writing, we've got casual speech, we've got regional dialects, slang. Czech is no different.
True. And I'd imagine Czech's history has probably played a huge role in shaping these different forms too, right?
You are so right. One of the biggest game changers for standard Czech was the Kralis Bible. And this was published way back in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Now, this wasn't just any book. It was a big, big deal because it was the first complete translation of the Bible into the Czech language.
Okay, so it's the Czech equivalent of the King James Bible, but with the added bonus of shaping the entire language as we know it.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. This translation had a huge impact because it really provided this common reference point for both grammar and vocabulary, which was super important, especially at a time when, let's be honest, Europe was a bit chaotic, with all the religious and political stuff going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've got to have some consistency somewhere. It's wild to think that one book could have such a lasting effect on a whole language. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
It definitely does not. Fast forward a couple centuries to the 18th and 19th centuries, and you've got the Czech national revival happening.
Ah, yes. This is where we really see people celebrating their Czech heritage, right?
Exactly. And a huge part of that whole movement was reviving and like further standardizing the Czech language. And that's where these like language superstars, Josef Dubrovsky and Josef Youngman, come in.
Language superheroes. Okay, I love those guys already. What they do.
They basically dedicated their lives to this stuff. They dove deep into like the origins of Czech, studied all these old texts, just worked tirelessly to establish a modern standard, especially for writing. And thanks to their efforts, and of course we got to give credit to the Krallis Bible for laying the groundwork, Czech not only survived, but thrived as its own distinct language.
Wow. It really makes you think about how much effort actually goes into not just shaping but preserving languages, especially considering that, sadly, not all languages are fortunate enough to have their own Dubrovsky and young men fighting for them.
Very true.
But that's a whole other deep dive for another time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got Standard Czech to thank these incredible linguists and a very influential Bible for.
The Common Czech just kind of happened.
In a way, yeah. It's like while all the scholars and linguists were busy formalizing Standard Czech, making it all official in books and documents and whatnot, people never stopped speaking in their own regional dialects and using all sorts of informal expressions, right? So over time, those variations, while they were still influenced by Standard Czech, of course, they developed into what we now call Common Czech.
So it's this constant push and pull between the two.
Yeah.
Standard Czech is laying down the foundation, and then Common Czech is keeping things fresh and evolving.
Exactly.
I like to think of them as two dance partners.
Each one is bringing their own unique style to the dance floor, you know?
I love that way of looking at it because it's true, right? They influence and shape each other, which is part of what makes like studying languages so fascinating. It's not a static thing. It's always changing and adapting.
Which makes me wonder, centuries from now, will Common Czech have, like, totally reshaped Standard Czech?
Or will they still be, like, coexisting on that linguistic dance floor?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of how language evolves, and it's not always predictable. Sometimes the most informal, most overlooked variations can actually have the most significant impact in the long run.
Okay, see, that's a pretty mind-blowing thought.
But before we get too existential about the future of Czech,
let's talk about the thing that I think everyone always thinks about when they think about Czech the way it sounds.
because, let's be honest, one of the things that Czech is famous for is that it sounds, well, kind of intimidating.
I can't really blame him. Czech does have a bit of a reputation for those consonant clusters and all those, like, really unique sounds, doesn't it?
And when we say unique, we're really talking about that sound, right?
The one that makes even the most adventurous language learners break a sweat.
You're talking about the hr, aren't you?
Yes.
The infamous Czech rah! It's so notorious, in fact, that linguists, they've actually described it as a raised alveolar non-sonorant trill.
Okay, even I need a translator for that one.
And I took, like, 2 linguistics classes in college.
Can we get a less technical and more human explanation, please? What is it about that R that's just so legendary?
Well, for one, it's super rare. You're not going to find it in many other languages, and that's part of what makes it so hard for people to learn. Like, imagine trying to say the English R sound, but at the same time, you're also trying to make a soft Z sound.
Oh, wow.
It's close to...
So it's like the linguistic version of patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time, but only with your tongue.
Pretty much. It takes a ton of practice, and even native Czech speakers, they've got to master it when they're kids.
Okay, so I think at this point, our listeners are sufficiently in awe and maybe also a little terrified of the Checker.
But can you at least offer a little bit of hope when it comes to the other sounds in Czech? Like, what about vowels?
Don't worry, vowels are way more approachable. Czech has 10 of them, 5 short and 5 long. And while they might not perfectly match up with English vowel sounds, they're fairly straightforward once you get a feel for them. And the best part is, unlike English, Czech spelling is very phonetic, which means you read it pretty much the way it sounds.
Oh, thank goodness.
At least we don't have to worry about all those silent letters and weird spelling rules with those vowels.
Exactly.
So Czech spelling is getting like a gold star for being straightforward.
But what about these hard and soft consonants I keep seeing in the materials?
Is that another one of those things that makes Czech grammar extra challenging?
It's definitely a key part of the grammar, yeah.
But it's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay, good.
It's more about how like consonants and vowels kind of team up to create these different sounds within a word.
Okay, so walk me through it. What's the difference between a hard consonant and a soft one?
Do we need to like join a metal band to pronounce these correctly?
No head banging required, I promise. Think of it this way. Hard consonants, they're pronounced with a bit more force, you know? They block the flow of air a little more. In Czech, these are consonants like D, G, K, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Soft consonants, those create a softer sound like ch, ch, sh.
Shh.
Okay.
Okay, I think I hear what you're saying.
So how does this whole hard-soft thing actually play out in the grammar? Like, does it change how you actually say the words?
It does, but kind of indirectly. It mainly affects how you change the endings of words, to match their role in a sentence. That's what we call declension.
Ah, yes, declension.
Every language learner's favorite word.
This is definitely one of mine, that's for sure.
But just as a little refresher, what is declension and why should we care?
Okay, so declension is basically how languages change the form of a word. It shows their grammatical function in a sentence. Like, is it the subject of the sentence? Is it the object? Is it showing possession? All that jazz.
Right.
And, in English, we mostly just rely on word order to do all that. But in Czech, kind of like in a lot of other languages, you actually change the endings of nouns, adjectives, pronouns, and you do it based on their role in the sentence.
Okay, so that's where the whole hard consonant, soft consonant thing comes in.
You got it.
Yeah.
Because the type of consonant that's at the end of a word, like the root of the word, it can actually dictate how its ending changes.
Oh, wow, okay.
Different consonants, different endings, it's all part of the system.
Speaking of systems, I've got to ask you about this because these sources mention that Czech has 7 cases.
7. I can barely handle English's, 3 cases.
And I use that term very loosely, by the way.
Give us the rundown. What are cases, and why does Czech need so many of them?
7 cases does sound like a lot, I get it. But here's the thing. Don't think about it like having to memorize a million different endings.
Yeah.
Think about each case as this tool, right?
Okay.
And each one lets you express a really specific relationship between the words in a sentence.
So it's less about just brute memorization and more about having all this extra precision with your meaning.
Exactly.
And the best part is the cases actually give Czech this incredible flexibility when it comes to word order.
Really?
You can move words around to emphasize things, to add style, whatever you want.
And the meaning is still crystal clear because those case endings, they're doing all the hard work for you.
Okay, that actually makes me feel a little bit better about the 7 cases thing.
It's like they're doing all the heavy lifting so you can sound super eloquent without even trying.
I love that. I'm going to use that.
But, in addition to all those cases,
Oh, there's more.
well, we also have 3 genders for nouns in Czech: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And just to keep things interesting, within the masculine gender, we also have this thing called animate and inanimate nouns.
Wait, hold on. Animate versus inanimate.
Are we talking about objects coming to life here? Because that is a whole other podcast.
Not quite. It's more about how Czech, categorizes nouns based on whether or not they're considered alive. So animate nouns, they're typically, things that are alive, like peas for dog.
Gotcha.
But then you've got your inanimate masculine nouns, and those can be objects, concepts like stool for table.
And yes, this also affects how you decline them.
Of course it does.
Why make things simple when you can have more grammar?
Right. That seems to be the Czech way.
That's what I'm thinking.
But honestly, once you start to see the patterns, the logic behind it all, it becomes a lot less about just memorizing. It's really about appreciating the elegance of how it all works together. Czech grammar isn't random at all. It's incredibly precise.
Okay, you're swaying me a little bit.
But speaking of elegance, how has Czech managed to keep up with the times, with all the new words and everything? Because it's not like they're still using the same vocabulary they were using 1,000 years ago.
Oh, absolutely not. And you're right, languages are always evolving. Their vocabularies have to reflect that. Czech is no exception.
So who are some of the biggest linguistic influencers on Czech? Who are they hanging out with on the linguistic playground?
Well, early on, it was all about German, Greek, and Latin.
And if you think about it, historically, this makes sense, right? Religious texts, academic stuff, these languages were a big deal in Europe.
Makes sense. So Czech was taking notes, picking up on some new phrases, maybe trying to impress the cool kids a little bit.
Exactly. But later on, as Czech kind of developed its own literary tradition, its own national identity, there was this big push to move away from some of those earlier influences.
Really?
Yeah. Linguists and writers started reviving older Czech words, even coming up with new ones that were based more on Slavic roots.
Oh, so it's like this whole linguistic homecoming.
Exactly.
A little linguistic rebellion. I like it.
But it wasn't just about rejecting those outside influences, was it?
No, not at all.
Because as Czech society modernized, it needed new words for all sorts of new things, new technologies.
You're exactly right.
Especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, you see this huge influx of English and French borrowings.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Especially in fields like technology, science, popular culture.
So the new cool kids were in town.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. Czech, it hasn't just borrowed words, it's also given back to this, like, big linguistic potluck.
What do you mean?
Some words that we just think of as, like, totally ordinary English words actually originated in Czech.
Okay, you have to give me an example. What English word is secretly rocking a Czech passport?
How about the word robot?
No way.
Really?
Yeah. That word, which is like used globally now, it actually comes from the Czech robota, which means like forced labor or drudgery.
Whoa, okay, I did not see that one coming.
It makes you wonder how many other quote-unquote English words are actually Czech spies just hiding in plain sight.
Right. It just shows you how connected languages really are. They borrow, they adapt, they influence each other in all these crazy ways that we probably don't even realize half the time.
It's like this giant linguistic tapestry or something, right?
Yeah.
All these different threads from different languages all woven together to make something totally new and beautiful.
Exactly. And you know what's even cooler is that Czech doesn't just like passively borrow words. It often takes them and adapts them, making them its own, which I think really reflects the Czech sense of humor and like their worldview a bit.
Okay, give us an example. How has Czech put its own spin on a borrowed word?
Well, think about the word email, right?
Okay. In English, it's a pretty straightforward, kind of boring technical term. But in Czech, they use the word email, but they often say it with this playful emphasis on the second syllable. It almost sounds musical when they say it.
So they took like a dry tech term and made it sound like a polka?
Exactly.
That's incredible.
It's like they're reminding us that even in this digital world, language can still be expressive and fun.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not all just ones and zeros.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered standard Czech, we've talked about common Czech.
But what about all those regional dialects that keep popping up in these materials?
It's like every language has its own little neighborhoods, right? So are there any Czech dialects where you'd hear someone say hello and instantly know, okay, they're not from Prague?
Oh, absolutely. Just like any language that's spoken over a wide area, Czech has its fair share of regional variations. And these dialects, they reflect all sorts of things. Local history, culture, even geography plays a role.
So when we talk about those Bohemian and Moravian dialects mentioned in these sources, are those like the two main neighborhoods within the Czech language?
Those are the big ones, yeah. Bohemian dialects, those are spoken in the West, and they tend to be a bit more unified. It's partly because of the influence of Prague and, common Czech. But Moravian dialects, those are spoken in the East, and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay. How interesting are we talking here?
Like, is this a Game of Thrones situation where every village has its own language?
Not quite that extreme.
But linguists have actually identified, like, several major Moravian dialect groups.
Wow.
And each one has its own, like, little quirks. And even within those groups, you'll find even more variation. It's kind of like zooming in on a map,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
The closer you look, the more details you see.
That's really cool. It's like these dialects are these little linguistic time capsules holding on to these pieces of the past.
Yeah.
And they show how people have moved around and interacted over, like, centuries, right?
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Because dialects can really tell us so much about the history of a language and the people who speak it.
Okay, you've officially convinced me a Moravian dialect tour is going on my linguistic bucket list.
But for now, let's circle back to Slovak for a minute, because we keep coming back to this close relationship between Czech and Slovak. Are they like the linguistic equivalent of those twins who are always finishing each other's sentences?
I love that analogy.
Because it's true. Their histories are so closely connected, and for a long time, they were actually considered dialects of the same language, not two separate ones.
So what happened? Did they have a falling out? Did they start listening to different linguistic music?
Well, it wasn't quite that dramatic.
While they definitely have those shared roots, there were all these different factors that kind of led them to become distinct languages. Like in the 19th century, both Czech and Slovak, they went through these processes of standardization,
Mhm.
and that really formalized a lot of their differences.
And then, of course, you can't forget about like all the political and social changes that were happening in those regions.
To kind of like when siblings grow up, they go their separate ways, they develop their own identities,
Yeah,
even though deep down they still have that like family resemblance.
exactly. And just like with siblings, there are bound to be a few rivalries and disagreements here and there.
But even with a little sibling rivalry, Czech and Slovak speakers can still kind of understand each other.
To a certain extent, yeah.
It's like having that secret language that only you and your sibling truly get.
Even if other people can maybe pick up a few words here and there.
I love that.
Okay, so we've explored Czech history, its grammar, even those, shall we say, interesting sounds.
But what about Czech in the digital age?
This is a language with incredibly deep roots, this rich literary tradition. But how is it adapting to, the internet, social media, artificial intelligence? How's Czech handling all that? That's such a great question. And it's something that, linguists are always paying attention to. Because here's the thing, languages, they're not these, static museum exhibits.
Right.
They're dynamic. They have to evolve. They're totally shaped by how people actually use them.
So how is Czech holding up in this whole digital mosh pit of new words and ever-changing tech speak?
I'd say it's not just holding up, it's totally rocking out.
Okay, I like where this is going.
For one thing, Czech hasn't been afraid to just embrace a lot of these new tech terms that have popped up in the internet age.
So no fear of borrowed words here.
Not at all. But what I think is super cool is that Czech hasn't just accepted those words as they are.
What do you mean?
They've adapted them, given them this uniquely Czech flavor.
Okay, we can't resist a good example here.
Give us an example. What's a Czechified tech term?
Okay, so how about the word computer? In Czech, it's počítač, which literally means calculator. So instead of just borrowing computer, they opted for a term that really highlights the main function, right? At its core, a computer is a machine that calculates information.
So it's like they're not just borrowing words, they're translating the very concept behind the word, and then they're fitting it into their own way of seeing things.
Exactly. And that goes way beyond just individual words. Czech linguists, language enthusiasts, they're constantly finding really creative ways to make sure the language stays relevant.
That's awesome.
They're coming up with new terms, they're adapting old ones. It's really all about making sure that Czech can express everything that's going on in our modern digital world,
It's like they're future-proofing the language, making sure that it's got all the right tools to handle whatever new technologies come along, right?
Exactly. And I think that really speaks to something deeper about the Czech language. It's not just about keeping up with the times, it's about making sure that Czech stays vibrant and relevant for generations to come.
I love that. So as we resurface from this deep dive into Czech, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember? What's the main takeaway here?
For me, it's that Czech is so much more than just a bunch of words and grammar rules, right? It's this living, breathing testament to how powerful human culture can be, how it adapts, how it thrives. It's got these deep roots. It's got all these fascinating quirks, and its future. It looks bright.
That is so well said. And for anyone listening who feels inspired to, maybe learn a few Czech phrases, maybe even go on their own language learning adventure, I say go for it.
You never know what kind of linguistic treasures you'll discover. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for guiding us through all the ins and outs, the wonders, even that infamous R of the Czech language.
Until next time, happy language learning, everyone.